I have been pleased over the years to be able to offer the cartographic community a wide variety of tutorials and map-making advice and other sort of cartographic resources, things like this. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is by far the least useful and therefore least popular among all those resources, but it's probably my favorite one, so I want to share the love with all of you. And that is my collection of hypsometric tinting schemes for maps of Mars. So when people make Mars maps, as they do from time to time, one of the things that they will show on those maps is elevations, and they will do this through some kind of color scheme, and that's a hypsometric tint. That's just cartographic jargon for colors that show elevations. And when I find a map like this one, or ones by some of you who are in the audience, I will have a look at those elevation colors, and then I will steal them and add them to my collection. I will sample those colors and store them in a Photoshop gradient like this, and I'll also store them in a QGIS style file that just records the RGB values and the particular elevation values that those pertain to, so I could open up QGIS and throw it on another DEM if I wanted to, for example. And then once I have those colors sampled, I will turn around and I will share them on a page on my blog with all of you, which you're looking at right now. So if I just browse past the preamble here, you can see all the different color schemes I've collected over the years. There's 16 of them in total, and there's some familiar names in there. Oh, hey, look, there's me. That was my favorite one, I'm going to say. We might come back to that one later. We'll see. In order to make comparisons easier between these various color schemes, I have made a new map for each one based on the colors that I stole and sampled that shows just the elevations, and I've also put them all on the same projection. Does anyone want to guess, or can you recognize what projection this is? It's equal Earth. It's such a trendy projection right now, and so I wanted to be stylish, but also I was amused by the idea of making Mars maps with a projection that has Earth in the name, and there's no reason you can't do that. If you want to follow along on this web page, either later on or just in lieu of listening to me, you too can search for an inventory of Martian hypsometric tints. I thought about providing like a bit.ly link or something like that, but then you'd have to write that down and remember it. Whereas 6 months from now, if you forget all of this, you can just go look in the program, and this is the title of my talk. And as Ken has demonstrated, this is pretty much all that's going to come up when you search for that phrase. I didn't plan on that being a demonstration, but I was just going to say that, and now we actually have seen hands-on. That's true. So, yeah. Why would I do this, though? It's kind of the big question. Why would I go to the trouble of stealing all these schemes and making maps for them and showing them off, etc.? And the answer is that, first off, people like collecting things. It's just fun. There's something about our brains that says, I have a group of things, and I want more of that group of things, and those can be abstract things or physical objects. I mean, our keynote speaker last night talked about collecting various signs and feathers and things, and I know some of you collect counties or keep track of countries you've been to, and people are busily trading map projection cards around. So it just brings me some joy, and I'd probably do it even if I didn't talk to any of you about it. But of course, you're not me, so it doesn't bring you nearly as much joy, so I need a better reason for that. To share it with all of you, and that is that I think through a resource like this, in some ways I'm kind of documenting a little bit of a cartographic frontier and hopefully producing a resource for potential planetary cartographers to maybe navigate that frontier. So here's what I mean by that. If we go back to the images, we have conventions for hypsometric tinting schemes of maps of Earth. Not every map follows this convention, but by and large, kind of as a profession, we've coalesced around things that look like this. You start with some sort of green colors in lower areas, and then you move through some combination or subset of yellows and oranges and browns as you go toward higher elevations. And then some of them finish off in the highland areas with white. And individual maps are going to use their own specific colors and their own shades of green, but by and large, we've coalesced around the broad strokes of this convention. And I think one reason that we are able to do that as a profession and agree upon this roughly is that in a very loose way, these colors kind of represent what we imagine the Earth to look like. The idea being that, we think, oh, there's probably more vegetation in lower areas, and then as we move up, we get more dry grasses and dirt and rock, and then we finish off with snow-capped mountain peaks. It's kind of an imperfect proxy for what the Earth actually looks like, and people like Tom Patterson and Bernie Yenny have written and talked about this, and it's worth reading their Cartographic Perspectives articles on some of the challenges of this, or just talking to either of them while they're here at the conference. But while it's somewhat of a flawed proxy, it's still useful, I think, because it's nice to narrow our field of choices. What color is the concept of elevation? You know, we have an infinite number of choices, so it's nice to be able to point to something on the surface of the Earth to help us solve that bit of a blank page problem and narrow things down. Mars, on the other hand, doesn't have a convention. People are all over the place, and one reason for that could be there aren't really a lot of Mars maps that are made, so there's not a critical mass for us to come to some agreement upon it. But also, Mars doesn't really have anything that we can point to on its surface to help us narrow this choice down. The surface of Mars is very uniform in appearance as compared to the Earth. There's nothing about its color that particularly varies, even loosely, according to the elevation that you're at. So we're kind of on our own. It's just up to our imagination to decide what we want to do with this. And this is where you get all of these different interesting items in the collection. I don't think this will always be the case, though. I think this is a frontier now. Things are unsettled, but I think sometime in the future, maybe it's going to be centuries from now, but maybe well within my lifetime, we will come to some convention for how we depict various things about Mars, including elevations. I have a couple of ideas where that might end up. It could end up with Earth-style hypsometric tints, and you can see a couple on the right there that look kind of Earth-ish. And that makes some sense in that cartographers are familiar with it and map readers are familiar with it, so why not just slap it on a different planet? I think if that were to happen, that's a bit of a shame, in my opinion, because I feel like Mars is a very different place, and people who might eventually live there will live in an incredibly different environment in life. And it would make sense if our maps honored that somehow and provided them with a Mars-style map, with Mars-style conventions, whatever those might end up being, rather than giving them an Earth map that doesn't represent the place that they're at. There are other avenues that we might end up sort of coalescing around. It's one that I noticed, for example, when I was preparing this talk. I've noticed that there's sort of a cluster of 3 or 4 different color schemes that hang together a little bit more with each other and look a little less like the rest of everything else. This one by Carl Churchill is an example of that. It's sort of got these rusty reddish orange hues, and then if I scroll down, you can see this one by Fabio Cramieri and colleagues, which looks kind of like a darker version of that. And if we keep going, Ken Fields looks a little bit like it's similar to that, maybe a little less saturated, a little more yellow. So these kind of look more like each other than they do, say, something like this one by Matt Schwastig, which is just coming from a different place. So I can see maybe that being an avenue of emerging consensus as well. But I'm not in charge of how this particularly shapes out. But that's what I mean when I talk about the idea of documenting this frontier. And maybe as time goes on, this collection will continue to reflect changes and coalescences or new ideas about how things go. But I also said this is a resource to help you potentially navigate that frontier. If you happen to be in the market for making a Mars map and you're not sure what colors to use, this could be a guide to you. This could be a starting point. Again, as we've seen how easy it is to Google an inventory of Martian hypsometric tints. I can't guarantee what happens if you use Bing, but I bet it's going to come up near the top there. But browse through these schemes, have a look, and see if there's something that you like. Get some idea of the aesthetics of each of them. But it's not just about making choices, to help narrow your options for what you think looks pretty or doesn't. You can also see how different people have grappled with some of the specific challenges of mapping Mars. So if I point out on the bottom of each of these, for example, there is a little gradient showing all the different colors in use, but also the specific elevations that those pertain to. And you can see I've marked where 95% of the elevations on Mars' surface fit in that ramp. Mars has a really skewed distribution as compared to the Earth. There are just a few huge outlier mountains on the left of each of these maps in the Olympus Mons and Tharsis Montes that blow out the ramp here. And so you have to decide, how much of my color space do I want to spend on showing those distinctions that don't necessarily take up a lot of space on my map, but are of very high important features. So people like Chris Herwig here have used several colors to make sure some of those spots stand out in red and yellow, for example, even though they're not big on as far as percentage of the map. Other people, like Ken Field, have used more constrained color ramps, and in his case, he kind of clips things off at about 5 kilometers and everything gets the same color. And in the case of the map of his that I stole this from, he's got shaded relief, so it's easier to tell where those mountains are. One of these approaches isn't better, they're just kind of different situations, different approaches to this challenge. But that's the kind of thing you could also get some inspiration for as you browse through here. Or you could decide that coming up with a new idea for these colors is hard, and you could just steal one of these schemes instead, like I did. If we scroll down to the bottom of the page here, there's an option to, there it is, download the schemes. You can click to download these gradients and QGIS color maps that I mentioned. Maybe I should make that a button. This was just a blog post several years ago that I assume no one would use or probably ever see, but maybe I could make it more user-friendly with like a download these button. I'll get to that when I get home. But if you want to make use of these, I make them available. I don't have any Esri-compatible files right now, but if one of you wants to make those translations of these colors into something that could be loaded into ARC, please let me know, and I'd be happy to share those as well. But whether or not you use these schemes on your own map, or you make your own and draw some inspiration from what I've got here, I hope you'll tell me about it, because while, again, I made this for me, for fun, it was nice to collect things, I didn't expect a lot of use to come out of this. It'd be really fun and slightly validating to realize that somebody actually did use this to make a Mars map, so send me a note. And especially if you make your own scheme, I'd like to know about it and add it to the collection. And that brings me to the real main point of this talk, which is I'm mostly here not to tell you about a resource you might not use, but I would like your help to make my collection bigger. So this is about me. This is about I need to know about more Mars maps. If you know of a map that is not represented in my collection right now, please send me a note or stop me in the hallway or whatever. I've got 16. I'm sure there's more different color schemes out there, especially if you know of one that's stuck in a book from some time ago where nobody ever scanned it and put it online. Most of these things were easily accessible through Google searches, but if there's a Mars map and planetary atlas from the 90s and nobody ever put it online, I'd like to know about that. So that's kind of all I've got for you. This is mostly about I would like to have the largest collection of hypsometric tints of any cartographer in the world for Mars. And I don't have a lot of competition, but I don't want to rest on my laurels, so I hope you'll give me a hand. But with that, I've probably got several minutes left, so feel free to ask me about my weird hobby. Yeah, so what's the story with this one? Is this the one you're talking about? Yeah. So this is a very dark one, and it looks basically roughly the same on this monitor. This is not a projector thing. There's just a little bit of red there. This is from a web map that was, it's designed to be a base map for other stuff to be put on. A couple of these come from Mars, Slippy map base maps, and I'm not sure what specific uses those tile sets ever find out there in the world of Mars mapping. I'm actually not super engaged with planetary cartography too much. I'm kind of coming in as an outsider who's interested in this, but there are people who engage with this more, and I don't know if any of you know of people like Henrik Hargitay, who's in the ICC Commission on Planetary Cartography, and he actually helped me find some of these schemes, for example. But I think, yeah, this is supposed to be just kind of a simple base map for putting light data on top of. Has anyone made a map of Mars? Raise your hand. Just curious. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's pretty good. All right, well, if I don't have your colors up here, you should tell me about it. I'd like to know.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, what determines the North Pole in Mars? I mean, some of those actually come into the flip of 180 because it actually looks as if you have the Earth continents go with our southern hemisphere or pointing upward.
I think so, yeah. So an odd thing about Mars, so things looking upside down, you're saying there's a thing called the Martian dichotomy, and there are theories for why this may exist, but basically the northern hemisphere of Mars, and you can look at kind of this scheme here where it's all darker on top. The northern hemisphere of Mars is several kilometers lower on average than the southern hemisphere. To the best of my knowledge, that has not been settled as to why, but you know, the north and south of Mars is fixed relative to its, you know, its axis and the plane of the ecliptic of the solar system. So, you know, their north is the same as our north. They're pointing the same way and spinning in the same direction. But it does feel weird to our human brain. Like things should be like the top should have more, right? It feels odd to me, and I think it feels odd to a lot of people. But it's a reality of the planet.
We have time for a couple more questions, if you're willing to.
Please. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think a lot of these Mars maps, so the question is what can we take from these Mars maps? Why is elevation, you know, it's this sort of, in some ways, an abstract thing. Was our elevation often a gravitational isosurface of the areoid rather than the geoid? So I think a lot of these maps, honestly, are made because people think Mars is cool and we need a data set to show, and elevation is often one of the only things you can show for Mars. So they've sort of fixed an arbitrary point on the surface. We say this is 0, there's no sea level on Mars. But, you know, scientists who study these things have fixed an arbitrary sea level point, and also they've fixed a prime meridian. They picked like a crater and say this is 0 degrees longitude, so we have an areographic coordinate system. And so I think for now, a lot of, more and more Mars maps will be made, but for now, a lot of it is just, we need something pretty and interesting to show. And, you know, we could fix that elevation baseline anywhere, and, you know, so we could take any of these and just add 8 kilometers to them, we'd get the same values. But I think there's just something, you know, human, we want, like, I can actually go on at some length about how Mars, since it doesn't have water, it doesn't create shapes for us to identify with in the same way we do with Earth, and so how most future Mars maps will probably be raster rather than vector. But I have a lot of sort of unformed thoughts about where things are going to go, and I'm excited to see what Martian cartography actually ends up being as people start to get more involved with the planet.
You would have 2 minutes to expound on that.
Yeah. I don't know if I have enough form. Maybe it'll be a future talk. We'll see. Oh, like an Irwin Royce type map? Yeah, I mean, if we go back to like that photograph, or, you know, this is not quite a photo, it like used surface imagery and put it on a fake globe kind of thing. I just got this from the JPL. But if anybody, yeah, so the question is, has anyone made like an an Irwin Royce style physiographic map? And so if you're not familiar, you can look him up, R-A-I-S-Z, Irwin Royce, Irwin with an E, and he did these lovely hand-illustrated physiographic diagrams illustrating different terrain types on the Earth. But I will say Mars is pretty, like, it's got flat areas that are very flat, and it's got some incredible mountains and some other interesting sort of volcanic bits of terrain and tectonics, but in some ways it is a lot less varied locally than Earth is, because it never had, like, you know, rivers flowing around and creating erosion and glacial landforms and things like that. So I've made shaded relief here and there of Mars, and, you know, it can sometimes look kind of less impressive than maps of Earth, and maybe that's also another reason why people are looking to throw elevation colors on there, because it gives something a little bit more texture to it. Yeah, good thought. Well, thanks everyone. Now I don't have to talk again.